Welcome back. All right, please take your seats. Hopefully you got those burpees in, some squats, little high knees. Our next speaker is ready to get started, and you won't want to miss a word of what he has to say. You did such a terrific job with questions for Dr. Dixon, so let's keep that up. And you don't have to wait for the Q&A of the session to start, so send those questions in as the Spirit moves you. Robert Cardillo will be moderating the Q&A, and I know he already has a few in mind, but let's arm him with some really cutting-edge questions. Here to introduce our next speaker is Dan Smoot, the CEO of Maxar Intelligence. Dan, thank you for being with us today, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Good morning. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Lieutenant General David Miller, Commander of the U.S. Space Force's Space Operations Command. For more than 2 decades, General Miller has played an important role in advancing U.S. capabilities in space domain. Over his career, he's held a range of operational and staff positions, including recently as Director of Operations, Training, and Space Force Development at U.S. Space Command. As Commander of Space Operations Command, General Miller today is responsible for building combat-ready space power for America, including accelerating capabilities for expertise in the country's cyberspace, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and of course, combat support forces. With the backdrop of today's geopolitical landscape, this mission has not been more important than it is today. Space domain is critical, providing U.S. and its allies with a strategic advantage. Space-based technology significantly enhance U.S. combat power and deliver more actionable insights. They provide us advanced warning to adversarial threats and greatly enhance our ability to protect our national security. But maintaining this advantage is a never-ending pursuit. The General himself has made a statement that his goal is to exceed and precede any potential threat vector. The goal can only be achieved by continuing to develop new integrated advanced technology solutions developed not only by the government, but of course, by the commercial sector. Emerging commercial capabilities such as space object tracking, non-Earth imaging significantly augment the U.S. space domain awareness capabilities. More advanced space-based sensors provide new opportunities for build integrated and sophisticated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architectures, and advanced analytic solutions can help Guardians make confident decisions faster, which is critical in today's era. But I don't need to stand up here and evangelize the importance of these technologies, because everybody here is very aware of their value. The challenge many of us are focused is how to integrate these solutions more quickly and effectively to support national security architectures in what's now a very highly contested domain. While there's still obstacles to work through, the government has been vocal about their commitment to utilize more commercial technologies, and they're starting to take actions to reduce those barriers. And a great example of this is Space Force's commercial strategy released last month, which is a great foundational start. But the industry must listen closely to government leaders who advocate for more integration, working to understand their priorities and requirements to meet this in these missions. General Miller is one of those leaders, and I am grateful that he's taken time to come here today and share his thoughts and opportunities in front of us. So with that, please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General David Miller.
All I do is win, 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 no matter what. Got money on my mind, I can never get enough. And every time I step up in the building, everybody hands go up.
You killed it at like the wrong point. How's everybody doing? This is kind of weak for this morning. How's everybody doing? All right. Careful with that. Well, thanks. Big deal. 20 years. Holy smokes. 20 years ago, where was I? Let's not talk about that. There's no video evidence. What I will say, congratulations. A lot has occurred in the 20 years since this organization was stood up. I know it's a long history for some. As I was walking in this morning, when I put on this uniform, I get the whispers. Who's that? What's he wearing? One of them even said, is that an American uniform? The best one I got was a couple of weeks ago. I was giving remarks, and you got work to do in clarifying your uniform when a 4-star in the United States Army says, is that a New Zealand Air Force uniform? So I know some of you are probably saying to yourselves, well, why is the Space Force here? Why is General Miller here? This guy's talking to us about the Space Force's perspective in particular and our application for GEOINT. Well, I think the context of my comments, and I do want to get to questions and answers in a little bit, but the context of my comments will speak for itself. I'm going to try to walk you through where we've been and why the Space Force, particularly my boss, General Saltzman, who couldn't be here today, asked me to come down and talk to you about where we're headed in surveillance, warning, tracking, and targeting, and in particular, why the lessons we've learned are being baked into where we're headed in the future. So I'll briefly just walk through that. I've only got a couple of charts to try to illustrate the point. Don't worry, you're not going to go to sleep. But we'll get through that, and then we'll get to your questions. But I think some of this will become apparent, and that the partnership that I understand has been spoken about earlier this morning between Space Force, commercial, our IC partners, as well as the joint and combined team is only going to increase. And we've got an opportunity now to seize, frankly, a level of focus on the high ground that probably has not been there so far. And that is really for the purposes of the missions of surveillance, warning, tracking, and targeting. And I'm hoping that that'll be a good discussion today. So if you can go to the next chart, please. All right. Does anybody know who this gentleman is? There we go. Who said that? Good job, sir. Well done. So you say, well, why is the Space Force, and my predecessor, my service for 28 years before I transferred to the Space Force for you, why are we involved in this dialogue? Well, it's largely because of this man. As many of you may recall, and if you don't know, I'll give you just a bit of history. In 1944, as the German V-2s were raining down on the UK, Hap Arnold and the commanders in the U.S. Army Air Corps, but also the combined force commanders, began to see one of the challenges that was going to face them moving forward. And that key challenge was fundamentally about seizing the high ground and being able to see, shoot, move, and communicate at a pace, speed, precision, and capacity that outpaces your adversary. He was so much behind it that in 1944, at the end of the year, he actually commissioned the Douglas Aircraft Company, a predecessor to RAND, to do a report. And that report you may have heard about is called the Assessment of the World's First Earth-Orbiting Spaceship. So before the Air Force was even the Air Force, the United States Army Air Corps and the commander of that, Hap Arnold at the time, were focused on space. And his principal focus at that time was on observation, is what they called it. And the assessment, if you actually read the report, talks about the fundamentals and the orbits, altitudes, and stabilization needed in order to do observation from space. So the reason we're involved and why the Space Force is so focused on mission areas associated with these operations is because it's in our DNA. It's in the DNA of the United States Air Force, our predecessor, and it's part of who we are and our covenant to the Joint Force. The members of the Joint Team expect us to see, shoot, move, and communicate at a pace, speed, precision, and capacity that outpaces any threat. And that's why we're here. That partnership that Hap Arnold had, frankly, with the predecessors of the intelligence agencies at the time, led to, ultimately, the picture you see on the right next to him, which is the Corona program. And that partnership led to a launch in '59, which was only 15 years after he commissioned the study. The operationalization of that capability came in 1960, and then, as they say, the rest is history. We began to look at alternatives to see what we could do, but not only what we could do, what was needed to be done in order to ensure that we could surveil, warn, track, and target at a pace, speed, precision, and scale that outpaces any adversary. At the time, right around the time of the launch, you'll recall it was in May, really, literally 24 years ago last week, that Gary Powers was shot down. And at that time, it began to be clear that denied area access, areas as air and missile defenses continued to evolve, that there were going to be places that airborne platforms just could not go. But that didn't erase the need for the Joint Force commanders to have access to surveillance, warning, tracking, and targeting information. So we continued, and there was a predecessor to my first program or weapon system that I operated on, which was the Defense Support Program. Its successor is represented here in a rendering on the bottom right in the Space-Based Infrared System, which is fundamentally about doing those same missions, providing denied area surveillance, warning of threat activity, tracking and targeting of capabilities, and providing that directly to Joint Force commanders. So I think you can see, well, why is the Space Force here? We're about seizing the ultimate high ground. That is literally the mission. When you read what Congress told us to do in the United States Space Force, that's the reason we're here, is we provide options to Joint Force commanders, the Secretary, and the President that are viable across all these mission areas I just spoke about a moment ago. The OPIR constellation in particular has demonstrated phenomenal improvements over the time just that I started. I mean, literally, DSP was launched and operated the year I was born in 1971. It is continuing to operate to this day. The space-based infrared system will continue, and we'll continue to talk about that integration moving forward, because ultimately, it's going to be an integration approach that delivers the outcomes that Joint Force commanders need. It's not about offline analysis. It's providing that directly to the shooters so that they can provide the effects on the battle space that we need. Go to the next chart, please. So you can see, you look at the national defense strategy and the priority potential adversaries that we're concerned about between Russia and China, that risk of denied area access is only increasing. As the PRC, and particularly Xi Jinping, seeks to remake the world order and reshape international norms to terms that are beneficial to him and that ultimately undermine the prosperity and economic security that underwrites what I think is the stability the United States and our allies have enjoyed over the past decade since World War II. As you see the expansionist aims of Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin with the invasion of Ukraine, and as you look at the weapon systems that they are using in each of these areas, whether it's the East Asian littoral and the pernicious activities that the PRC and the PLA are doing in particular to pressure and coerce states in that region to comply with their access for vital minerals, resources, and other. When you look at what the capabilities that the Russians are building and using in and around Ukraine, which is right on the border of NATO, you'll see that the applicability of surveillance, warning, tracking, and targeting isn't going to lessen in the future. And the viability of the airborne platforms that we may have relied on in the past is only going to be more and more limited, because those same air and missile defenses, those same anti-access or area denial capabilities are going to be a challenge moving forward. So with that scene setter, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned in particular and how we see this as a natural evolution of our mission sets that we've had in the past. In particular, why Congress in the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act told the Secretary of the Air Force to present air and ground moving target indicator capability from space to Joint Force commanders. That is why we're here today, and I'm talking to you, and that is why we insist on and hope for continued strengthening of this partnership, whether that's the joint team, our combined team, or IC and commercial partners. Move on to the next chart, please. So what you'll see here in this chart is really where we've been, and recently, I'll take you through as recently as last month, what we saw in Israel and in Southwest Asia, and explain to you some of the lessons that we've taken away from that in particular. So really for us, in the Department of the Air Force, one of the quintessential events that really spoke to the capability that a moving target indicator system could provide was when, in the Battle of Khafji, the JSTARS capability, we call it our E8, was available and frankly brought out of test and fielded early at the request of General Horner, who was the Joint Force Air Component Commander at the time. And the reason is he knew the sophisticated level of air defense system that the Iraqis had acquired and put in place. And that he also realized that they were going to have a level of access and focus, particularly on the armored and mechanized infantry, artillery, and so on that the Iraqis had. That really played itself out at the end of January and moving into the first day of February in 1991. We were just ramping up the air campaign, if you recall. You guys will remember the smashing of the Iraqi military forces that decided to stay in place in some cases or decided to run along one highway at that time. We had not started the ground campaign, and so Saddam Hussein went to southern Iraq, talked to his commanders, and focused on launching an attack into Saudi Arabia to seize the port of Khafji, which also had some reserves and so on that they wanted to achieve. That was an attack that fundamentally showed the value of a moving target indicator capability. If you recall, there were up to 12 specific maneuver battalions, 13 field artillery battalions. This was no small effort by the Iraqi military. They advanced under the cover of night, and because we had the JSTARS capability, they were able to find, fix, track, and actually feed that targeting information directly to platforms that were used to destroy that attack. While the initial onslaught may have been a surprise to some, even though some of our Marine brothers and sisters warned about that the day before, the response was overwhelming, to the point that the Iraqi commander at the time said the United States Air Force, which is really a coalition response, it wasn't just the United States Air Force, but the United States Air Force did more in 30 minutes to decimate the Iraqi maneuver elements than 8 years of war with the Iranians did. And that's the level of focus and value that you see in surveillance, warning, tracking, and targeting capability offered by moving target indicators. It doesn't just apply in the past, though. Last month, if you were paying attention, on the 13th of April, you got to see what the future might look like when the Iranians launched about 120 drones at Israel, 70, I think, or so cruise missiles, and another 130 ballistic missiles from platforms that were moving into place over previous days and fundamentally able to reload and refire if needed, if that was the aim. You can see, while the applicability across those mission sets in the past, and where it was usually in the instantiation of Corona, an analysis or analytical function, we no longer have the time for analysis. One of the key lessons is the Joint Force Commander needs to directly be able to task those assets and prioritize retasking as the battle unfolds. He or she simultaneously needs to be able to get that information delivered directly to the shooters. Operational headquarters and agencies back in the rear don't win or fight conflicts. It is tactical forces on the ground who need the information they must have in order to find, close with, and destroy the enemy. And this was actually a remarkable success. And it spoke to not just the potential for future missions in the past. I can tell you that in my command, the men and women at Buckley Space Force Base, our joint tactical ground stations throughout the globe, provided infrared surveillance, warning, tracking, and target cueing to support this effort, just like you would expect us to do with additional capabilities in the future. So it's not just something that's in the past that we focus on what happened in Desert Storm. The relevance of these capabilities and why it's in the National Defense Authorization Act this year for direction to the Secretary is because the applicability in potential future conflicts. I think the key to take away here is the Joint Force Commanders on the 13th of April, and particularly General Kurilla, had the information needed to make decisions, reapportion forces, and act to defend both U.S. and coalition forces without interceding and waiting for analytical results. And that's the power of the partnership I'm talking about we need moving forward. Go to the next chart, please. So for tomorrow, in particular, focused on the fight in the 21st century, we've got to recognize that some of these habits are going to be new ones that we reform. I already told you that when we had Corona, you guys remember the big light tables? We'd bring back images people be pouring over this stuff and they're going as fast as they can, but the sheer mass of information made that sometimes take hours to days to weeks to get the assessment. As you saw in COFG, we speeded it up. I don't know that we got to the point where JSTARS was doing targeting directly, but they were certainly doing battle management, surveillance warning, and tracking of the adversary. The battle space of the future requires a few key things, and those things are the lessons that I spoke to you about that we learned in the past. One of them is give the Joint Force Commander the team of experts that she or he needs to task and, most importantly, retask systems directly to prioritize their operational requirements. They don't go through a headquarters in the rear, they do it directly. Obviously, the SecDef will make an apportionment recommendation on these capabilities and decide what that apportionment is to the combatant commanders, but within that decision space, that commander owns his or her own destiny. The second piece that we've got to be able to do is ensure that the information goes directly to the shooters. We cannot have it so that it goes back through a headquarters, gets filtered in information, and then gets sent out. The kill webs that our adversaries are building don't do that. So if our commitment or covenant to the Joint Force from America's Space Force is to outsee, outshoot, outmaneuver, and outcommunicate an adversary, we can't do it either. The information must go directly to the shooter with the target quality, precision, and capacity, but also the custody required in order to deliver and fire for effect. The final piece that we're going to have to take with us as a key lesson is that it's got to be interoperable. Too long, and I know some of you have fought this battle your entire careers. I'm telling you, we're fighting it still today. We have built systems in our intelligence enterprise, but sometimes in our operational enterprise, candidly, that we stamp no foreign on everything. That is a recipe for losing. The United States does not go into conflict alone. Check your history. It doesn't happen. It must be interoperable. We need to have our coalition partners a part of the formation and their shooters ready to receive this information, and it goes directly to them at the same time it goes to the United States Air Force or whoever the shooter is on our side. Those are the three things we took out of the battle space in the past. And those are the three things that are fundamentally defining our operating concept moving forward. I think when you look at our history, it's going to be absolutely required that those three things are fundamental. I also think if you look at our history over the past 30 years, this focus is not where we've been trained to. The left side of your chart is what we were focused on largely for 30 years. And as usual, when America's sons and daughters get focused on something, we get damn good at it. And we were damn good at it. What I'm telling you is the paradigm of the future requires a different approach. And that approach doesn't have time for offline analysis. Doesn't have time for days-long decision-making like you've seen in the past. It requires information directly for Joint Force Commander tasking to the shooter and with the combined force approach that doesn't limit, but rather enables operations moving forward. We have a commitment to the Joint Force and the Space Force, and that is to provide surveillance warning, tracking, and targeting data that will outpace, with a level of precision, speed, and capacity, any adversary. The reason I'm here talking to you today is because that's what Congress wants us to do. That's what they've directed my service secretary to do. And that's the capability we're working with you, other members of the intelligence community, and frankly, some other partners around the world to field. I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Hey, Robert.
Well done.
Thank you, buddy.
Much.
I'm gonna grab another water.
You can have as much water as you'd like.
Are we sitting or are we standing?
I think we're standing.
We're standing. Cool.
The uniform looks good.
You like that?
Yeah. Is that all right?
I think I look great. I mean, what do you guys think? Does the uniform look good? That's why I come out to all I do is win.
Yeah, I heard great. I heard awesome. Well, thank you for all of that. I want to especially thank you for the historic context that you provided, right? Where we've been, where we are, where we need to go. I especially resonated with May 1960 shoot down of the U-2 because recall at the time we were in a very, very deep Cold War.
You bet.
And we had really one way to share with our chief decision maker, in this case President Eisenhower, what was happening on the other side of a wall, right? An iron curtain, if you will. And with that shoot down, we lost our vision, right? We could no longer see. But as you recognized, we had another team working a program called Corona.
You bet.
Had another way to look over the wall. And that first operational image from Corona came 109 days after the shoot down. So that's a gap we shouldn't have had, but thank God we had wizards that created an answer to that solution.
Absolutely.
So I love that because that's what this room is, quite frankly. The innovators that created, one, the U-2, which was an amazingly innovative project, obviously, but then two, the Corona program, their legacies here today. So with that as a framework, I want to start with Space Operations Command.
You bet.
And again, the way you talked about the global competition and how quickly we have to adjust, how is that command adapting its strategies and its approaches and to provide space situational awareness, superiority,
Yeah.
and the protection of assets, and many of those assets are flown by teammates in the room. But how are they stepping up to those challenges, General?
You bet, you bet. I'm just going to put this here for a second. Thank you. So I think I'll capture it this way. About 2 weeks ago, the Chief of Space Operations put out, he has these C notes. And these are notes that he sends directly to the force. I don't know if have any of you guys seen these yet? Okay. It's a communication method that he uses to ensure that the force is tracking sort of what he's thinking, but he also queries the force on feedback at that time. His last C note that he sent out a few weeks ago was focused on our new model for force generation. So Robert, I'll answer the question in that regard. We are fundamentally changing the way we are generating combat-ready space power in Space Operations Command. In the past, when Dave Miller was a young lieutenant or captain, this is the facts, as I was preparing to operate the space-based infrared system, which is the most awesome weapon system ever, you know, I had a task list that I trained to. And that task list, let's say it was 100 tasks that were on there. And before I finished training, and actually it was contractor-provided training by Lockheed at the time, I had to be certified to be able to do those tasks. And I was checked off by somebody that I could do it. In the past, when we trained and readied our forces, we would go through that task list, and our training fundamentally over the previous year, over a year, would be break that task list into quarters and then train on that repeatedly in order to get capability and certify their readiness. What's missing from that approach, ladies and gentlemen? Time is good. What else? The enemy. What you didn't hear in there is that the training was tailored specifically to address the mission threads for the operational plans that Joint Force Commanders ask us to fight. Not only didn't address the operational plans and mission area work required inside of missile warning and missile tracking as my mission area, it didn't address an integration approach across other mission areas. Finally, there was no place where you saw combined forces or intelligence community or other assets in that training. So when I say we're remaking it, what we're doing right now is taking an approach to our training model that is fundamentally different. No question, my 100 tasks, let's say, to get trained in the space-based infrared system as a combat crew commander, valuable, I need that, but insufficient to where the end state needs to be. I need to be able to track and train across my mission area. So remember a couple of years ago in July of 2021, the PLA launched and demonstrated an orbital bombardment capability. The capability to warn, track, and ultimately target that requires both overhead as well as ground-based systems moving forward. In my Delta IV, which is commanded by Colonel Schmidt, he has the overhead systems for infrared surveillance. He also has the ground-based radars that the Space Force operates that provide that warning and tracking. So there's mission area training that he needs to do now, and now he understands that, and those priorities and exercises and training evolutions are built into his training pipeline now. But that's not enough, because the space-based infrared system, we've done such a good job at marketing it. We launched SBIRS 6 a couple of years ago. You guys remember that? Guess how many SBIRS there are when you're launching SBIRS 6? 6. It's not a surprise. We did such a good job at advertising and marketing that capability that everybody knows exactly how many there are. We're so good at OPSEC, we tell everybody when we're going to launch it. And so the problem for an adversary who we know is seeking to undermine and has built their service capability to target United States forces is an easier problem set. So I can't just be worried about training in missile warning, missile tracking, and targeting. I got to train for defense. I got to train with my ISR Delta, Delta 7, for indications and warning of threats. In the future, as we field those capabilities, I've got to protect that system. And that's where you get what's going to happen here in July, the first ever integrated warfighting team presentation of forces that the United States Space Force will provide combatant commanders. They will be trained across all mission areas, not just their unit mission master task list. And because they're trained against all mission areas, they're more relevant to the operational requirements that Joint Force Commanders have us trained to. Over the next 6 months, we'll spiral in joint, combined, and as I was talking to this morning, our commercial partners into this as well, because this will just be one team, ladies and gentlemen, that goes against any adversary. And up until now, our training has not adapted to deal with or contend with the threat. So our approach to generating combat-ready space power has fundamentally shifted. It is a level of focus on unit, mission area, as well as integrated warfighting team training that I think will be much more relevant to the future. And that incorporates every mission area across the 15,000 men and women in Space Operations Command. And that's in our installations who protect those forces, all the way to our space domain awareness capabilities, whether on orbit, GSAP, or you name it. They're learning to train and fight together, so they'll be ready to train and fight together.
Great. I neglected to mention when I came up about how you all enter questions. Thankfully, you guys knew how to do it, so thank you for sending these up. But if you forget, you can text to 22333 your questions. So I'm going to move to an audience question. It builds upon the end of your answer there where you talked about that commercial partnership.
Okay.
This room represents a broad array of both ground-based and space-based capabilities to do awareness of assets in space and also threats on the ground to assets in space. Mm-hmm. How would you like, and look, I was in government for 37 years. I think I can appreciate, right, the
You look like you're 29.
Thank you very much.
I don't think you were in government.
Can you come back next year? Every year?
Every
please?
year, yeah.
But look, I certainly experienced firsthand, the intent of the government is to do exactly as you say, and then sometimes our own policies, our own procedures, which, by the way, all came with good intent, right? Protection, stewardship of taxpayer dollars, and open and fair competition. So they come from a good place. But sometimes those procedures end up inhibiting this partnership. So now I'm going to ask you to really ask the room, is there something the industry can do to be a better partner for you and for your team? Mm-hmm. Again, both sides of the equation, but to help create the outcomes that you've described here today. Is there something that we could be better at to help you be better?
Sure. Wow, that's a big question. All right, I'll give it a shot, and then I'll take it to the audience. There's no one thing. As many of you know, you've been in this business, some of you longer than I have. I'm also 29. I just joined the Space Force when I was -4. I think an area where we could look to make improvements is in a couple of key places. One area, I'll call it, is in our force generation. So an area where we can certainly partner and do better is in developing and fielding the training and environments we need in order to prepare our guardians, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines for the fight that we hope will never come. Right now, as you can imagine, particularly when you look at the events in the Middle East, I think, how about we just agree that America's Navy is freaking incredible, right? And America's Air Force, who probably got underreported of how much they did to protect U.S. and coalition forces in Southwest Asia on the 13th of April, intercepting those attacks, was also pretty freaking incredible. Yeah, thank you guys. And our Army Air Defenders, God bless them, they're everywhere, and we don't have enough of them. One of the things we've got to do in order to be ready for the potential futures that we spoke about a moment ago on the chart is to find a way to train to the highest possible threat standard in an environment that we are comfortable letting the gloves off of all our capability, and that's likely not going to be a live environment. And I think that's an area where you see the Joint Staff in particular, the services, I know my boss has made it a focus, but the service chiefs overall ask for and expect a level of training and exercising in our generation model that ensures that, you know, just like Red Flag used to be, that you've heard about, that the first 10 missions that any Guardian, soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine is going to face, they've seen as much as they can because we owe it to them for them to be part of this team. So I think we need your help there. That is an area where we need to focus. I will time-bound that help, though. There is a certain seductiveness to looking at ranges and training as these 15-year perfect projects that we never get to. I would ask you that our time standard that we have is not that. As you've heard my service secretary say, we are out of time in many ways. And so if your offer is in 15 years we can build, I'm not interested, to be honest with you. If your offer is, here's what we can do tomorrow, on a way to, we're on a way to excellence, that's the kind of discussion I think we need to have. The second piece I'll give you is, in particular to this discussion today, our commercial partners can help us by ensuring that we don't, and I think you saw some of this in our commercial space strategy that the CSO released, I think it was last month. Our focus is not just on overhead capacity, for example. Our focus also needs to be on the ground-based systems and tools that allow us to turn that information into decision advantage and ultimately into the ability to close with and destroy an enemy. And we need to do it, as I said, at a speed, pace, precision, and with a capacity that outstrips any adversary. So don't just focus on the system on orbit. Help with also the infrastructure we need on the ground and the tools to exploit that information and turn it into targeting and tracking information that a Joint Force Commander can use. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. You mentioned where the Space Force is in its evolution, relatively young compared to our other services, but obviously the tradecraft and the experience goes back decades. Yep. As you think about, and as the CSO thinks about organization responsibilities, your briefing talked about what has historically been a tension between our intelligence professionals and our operational, users. In breaking down some of those barriers, how has the Space Force thought about its maturity in such a world in which we want those two elements especially working more interdependently?
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't live in D.C., so thank God. So that probably came out wrong. Scratch that from the record. So I haven't heard personally some of this discussion. Let me summarize it from where I sit as the command in the Space Force that will likely have to determine or at least have a part in how we're going to generate this force to operate and present to combatant commands. It ultimately, is not presented to me. I'm one that helps get it there. I think the model we are approaching now, where our partners from the National Reconnaissance Office were asked by CSO number 1 to acquire and operate this system. The approach we're taking with our Joint Force Commanders, and we're going through tabletop exercises right now, actually. My team is a part of those, where we are working with the JFC, the Joint Force Commanders and combatant commanders to determine what is the best way to integrate this. I think we've come down on a couple of key things. Number 1, we need a regional element. It's really up to that combatant commander how she or he wants to do it. If that combatant commander wants it embedded in their J2 shop, perfect. If that combatant commander wants it embedded in their fire shop in J3, and if they want it embedded in one of their components, perfect. That's really up to them. They get to organize their forces as they see fit. What I think has been helpful is the combatant commanders are involved in the process to the point where they say, hey, number 1, we need a regional element because we got to be able to prioritize and task directly, and I want that information to come back in formats that are releasable to my combined partners. The second piece is we recognize that that apportionment decision that the Secretary will make, Secretary of Defense, will ultimately drive and be shaped based off of the security environment. So it will change. And moreover, as you learned from the Gary Powers incident, our job is to operate a system that's resilient, that we know an adversary will try to target. So over time, those priorities and that capacity may change. We will also need a global element that will take in reprioritization, tasking, be able to account for apportionment decision changes. I think we are flexible there as well, and that we are letting the TTXs take us where it needs to go. From where I've seen a willingness to partner. I think our major concern goes back to our legacy, back to Hap Arnold. Anything that introduces delay in data being provided to commanders and shooters to either defend themselves or their team or prosecute and close with and destroy the adversary, we're just not going to support that. So, and I don't think anybody would support that. So if those are the fundamentals, I think we can agree on a lot. I think right now, some people get real caught up in whose patch is on the door. I think we'll settle that and get through that. This is early in discussion. In some cases, you guys. So I have, my boxer passed away a couple of years ago, but I remember when he was a puppy, we took him to the dog park, and you guys have been there, and the dogs spend 5 minutes sniffing each other's butts. That's the phase I think we're in. We just need to get off of that. Nobody's here to hurt anybody. Everybody's a dog. We're all on the same team, okay? We're all going to get a chance to play. Put your baggage behind you and get focused on the real product. Tactical units fight and win the nation's wars. Give them the priority, the tasking authority, and the capability to give them targeting information. If we can agree on that, we're going to be in a good place. Okay? All right. Hopefully that answers the question.
So I like to predict what soundbite is going to resonate. And by the way, there's
a reason I don't live in D.C., right?
To remind you, sir, this is on the record, okay? And before you gave me that answer, I thought no foreign is a losing proposition. I said, oh, that's a good line. That's going to resonate out there. But I don't know how you beat dog sniffing now, so. But I'm going to give you at least one more question, so you got a chance to even raise the bar higher. Let's talk more about...
My last speech ever. It's good.
Let's talk more about no foreign. You brought it up. You made it clear how you know that when we make that choice, right, we put that stamp on it, we inhibit our capability to fight because we don't do it alone.
It's more than that, though. I mean, you guys got to... Folks who have been deployed know this. You put a burden on the tactical maneuver element that I don't think people understand. And it's just not the way joint and combined operations work. Moreover, we've got guidance from the Secretary of Defense now on classification for space capabilities. All I'm saying is follow the SecDef's direction. I think in our past, our default has been just U.S. only, at times. And I think that's just, it just flies in the face of how the U.S. fights. It's not how we do business. So.
And I don't know if you heard earlier, we've got 35 partners, national partners, international partners here with us at this conference. So they're here, and they're all in as well.
Yeah.
We just need to find a way to get that yes foreign stamp moving more quickly. You mentioned the risk cyber, right, coming at us. Obviously, our adversary is going to leverage every availability they have to undermine our operations. And let's face it, we're both moving fast into this world of artificial intelligence. How do we apply it in a way that's both useful and trustworthy? How do you think about that competition? And I guess on a cyber perspective, how are we training our guardians to prepare for such a world?
Yeah.
It isn't prepare, it's the world we're in now, so that we can ensure accurate and reliable information flow to the warfighter.
Yeah, so I just had the good fortune to visit. So the Delta, the 06 level command that I have that does cyber is actually at Schriever Space Force Base, and I just had a chance to visit them on Thursday of last week. Excuse me. So I can speak, at least firsthand from what those young guardians, I think, are seeing. I think a couple things have evolved that I think show some promise. So from our perspective, and many of you may not know this, but we embed our defensive cyber capability into our operational combat crew and force element. So for SBIRS, my mission as an example, at Buckley, there is the 64th Cyber Squadron who's embedded in that formation. They're on mission, which SBIRS is one of the largest military weapon system networks that we have. They're looking at the places where we see the most likely vectors. They're receiving tailored intelligence of what those adversary threats might be. And they're operating in partnership with the combat crew commander so that she or he knows if, when, or how there's any type of risk, and they can make an informed decision about that risk together. I think that's promising, and I think that's goodness. That is a level of integration that we simply, if you just, there was none of that when I was a crew commander. I didn't have tools. And we're in the process of fielding tools, but also, thank you to our commercial partners, and some of you know who I'm talking about, who are helping us. We're updating those at a pace that, frankly, is pretty impressive. So that's goodness. I think the other piece is, as we look to this integrated force generation model, the leaders of some of our training and evolutions are our cyber guardians. And they have clued many of our team into a level of awareness about the threat that I don't think that they've had in the past. And then I think the final piece that I think is goodness, and I was talking with Mr. Calvelli about this a couple weeks ago, the standards at which we're looking at our weapon system acquisition now, and from a modernization lens, requiring that cyber security on the end of the weapon system, but also what we're doing to partner with U.S. Cyber Command so that we're not just sitting back waiting for threats. I think that is making significant progress, and I think there'll be even more progress this year as we look to field what our component to U.S. Cyber Command looks like in the future. That's something that is under consideration right now in the Space Force that our Service Chief and Secretary are working their way through, and I think that's going to be just a game changer for us. So it isn't easy. There's a lot of threat vectors out there, but simultaneously, I think that you'd be real happy with what the work that our Guardians are doing in order to help protect and defend those capabilities that the nation holds so dear.
Well, thank you for that, but also thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your mission and your demand signal with our team here. I know they'll take it away and get on it to support the needs you have. Great. But also thank you for who you are and where you are and what you're doing. We realize it's a very important work in progress. You're clearly the right leader at the right time.
I don't know about that after some of the remarks I made.
Yeah, but no, that headline's going to be great.
It's going to be great.
But please join me in thanking General Miller
Thanks, guys.
for his time this morning.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.